As you know from the registration, when you registered, we're calling this show It's Showtime. And that definitely refers to what we anticipate happening next Wednesday, November the 3rd, with the start of special session. So all the work that so many folks have joined in doing over these months of 2021 are now hopefully going to pay off with a special session, a successful special session. So if we can go to the next slide, and we'll just review the agenda before we get started. First of all, I guess I should say that I'm Janet Grant. I always forget to say that. I'm Janet Grant, welcoming you here, and I'm the Vice Chair of Fair Districts Georgia. We're really excited today to have ACLU of Georgia joining us again. If you've been coming to these town halls every month, you know that a couple of other times we've also had ACLU folks joining us. And today we're pleased to have David Goldman and Vasu Abhiraman. If I think nailed that name. Vasu and David are attorneys with the ACLU, and they're going to participate in the conversation around what we should be looking for, and particularly around minority representation. Ken is going to review the evaluation of the proposed congressional maps. We have 2 maps out, one from the majority party and one from the minority party. Obviously, they look a little bit different, but we've had our folks at Princeton do an evaluation, and we're going to share that with you. We will go into the ACLU preview, and then we have another special guest with us. Representative Margaret Oliver is joining us, and she's one of the longer term legislators in the General Assembly and has been through multiple cycles now of redistricting. So she's going to give us a sense of what to expect. And then we have lots of things, ways for you to get involved over the coming few weeks in supporting fair maps. So we're going to review that. Next slide. We want to do a little bit of bragging on this next slide about both our recognition as well as that of our partner with ACLU. And that is that the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus named both of us Advocacy Partners of the Year. And we were recognized as a redistricting partner with Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. We've developed a very nice working relationship with them and have been part of the town halls that they've been doing all across the state on redistricting. And our friends at ACLU were recognized for all the work, wonderful work they do on voting rights. So it was a very special evening, and we wanted to share with you that recognition. And with that, we'll go one more slide, and I think I'm going to introduce Ken to you. And Ken, as many of you know, is our chair of Fair Districts Georgia, and he's going to walk us through this congressional map evaluation. Ken?
Thank you, Janet. Can everybody hear me all right? Janet, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So these little cartoons are probably a little bit one-sided here in terms of what we might expect to see in the congressional maps, but we're going to show you a couple maps tonight. But we think these are kind of like indicative of the mood of the country as we get into this redistricting cycle. But as we've mentioned in the past, you know, both parties have been guilty of redistricting, partisan gerrymandering. As Janet mentioned, you know, we talk about fair maps, and it's time to really judge, are the maps that we are seeing fair? And we really have 3 general areas that we look at to determine if the maps are fair. Number 1, these maps should reflect voters' political preferences. That means the natural political preferences of voters as they are distributed across the state, as we are distributed across the state. And these maps should allow for competition. You know, competition breeds excellence in all walks of life. We think that also should be true in political representation. The map should reflect Georgia's diversity. As we've seen from the census data, very, very diverse state now. It's a multidimensional diversity. And so we want to make sure that the maps provide sufficient majority minority districts complying with the Voting Rights Act and really preserve, you know, opportunity and influence districts. And then lastly, the map should honor communities of interest. And this is the trickiest part, because so many communities have provided input to the General Assembly, to the committees throughout the hearings in the summertime. many people spoke up about their communities. It's a very difficult job, frankly, to draw a map that satisfies everybody's interest, but also meets these fairness tests around political preferences and diversity. And we're going to be talking mostly about the political preferences and diversity stuff this evening. Now, just as a backdrop to talk about the congressional maps, we have two maps that are out now, and we're going to show you those two maps in just a second. But as a backdrop, we've been studying the political landscape in Georgia, really going back to the 2000 timeframe when Democrats had the control to redistrict. And over the last 10 years, especially, we've tried to look at, between censuses, what has happened. So we talked about the census data, but let's talk about the political landscape. What this chart shows you is that with respect to Congress, the purple bars in the chart are how many seats were won by the Republicans. Therefore, the Democrats had the balance, right? And you could see that the peak representation for Republicans was in the 2014-16 range. But since that time, as the statewide vote share has gone much more towards 50-50, that representation has now arrived after the 2020 election with 8 Republicans and 6 Democrats in our delegation. Now that change reflects this brown line on the chart, which is on the right-hand scale. And the brown line really talks about the fact that back in the 2010 timeframe, we were a much more Republican-minded state because we saw that in statewide races like president and senator and governor, our vote would be 55 or 56% Republican. Well, now in 2020, over the last 2 cycles, we were just slightly Republican in 2018. We're just slightly Democratic in 2020. We view this as we're a swing state because no one knows what it's going to be the next time around. But very clearly, we have arrived as a swing state at this point, with our delegation in Congress being 8 Republicans and 6 Democrats. So now, to understand, what should the new maps look like, we have engaged, as you all probably know, you've heard this from us many times, with Princeton University. The Princeton University Gerrymandering Project has built for us statistical benchmarks for these new maps. And now that we have maps, we can evaluate them. And we'll show you how we applied those benchmarks to the congressional maps. And again, the benchmarks look at partisan balance, they look at competitiveness, and they look at minority representation. And we look at that across 3 maps, the House, the Senate, and our congressional delegation. So here are the 2 maps that we have. The one on the left is the one that was released on September 27th by the Senate committee chair and Lieutenant Governor Duncan. It's we call it the GOP or the Republican proposal. And as the advertising says, Lieutenant Governor Duncan says, this is a map that regardless of political party, Georgians can be proud of. Well, the Democrats said, we'd like to introduce another map. And so last Thursday, literally, we got a Democratic proposal that was built by the Democratic caucus, working under the auspices of the legislative staff committee. And this map has been released, and it's quite a bit different. And Representative Sanford Bishop says that this map recognizes Georgia's rich diversity and evolving political landscape. So they both sound pretty good when you read the advertising. If you look just for a second at these maps, the one big thing you'll notice is that on the left-hand map, and I may try to point this out on the screen, there's a district called 10 over here, which is in the northeast part of the state here. In the new map, and excuse me, that's in the GOP, the Senate map, the committee's map. The map produced by the Democrats merges basically 9 and 10 together, and District 10 is now over here in Cobb County. So these numbers don't correspond anymore, but the map on the right-hand side is much more of a redraw in this area than the map on the left-hand side, which really was more of a shifting of current boundaries. Some of the other districts, they've changed shape a little bit, but we basically have now 2 competing proposed maps. And they're both advertised as being quite fair to Georgia. Well, let's take a look and see, what do these maps actually produce when you think about our delegation. So here's what happens, right? The current map on the left-hand side is, like I said, 6 Democrat, 8 Republican. The Republican proposal takes us to a 5 Democrat, 9 Republican choice. The Democratic proposal is for a 7 Democrat, 7 Republican choice. So they're very different, okay? Some people look at the Democratic map and say, well, look, we're a 50-50 state. Shouldn't the districts be 50-50? Well, not so fast, because people in Georgia don't live in nice, neat, orderly rows where you can draw lines that way. We tend to live in these polarized clusters, and so you have to take that into account when you're trying to figure out how to draw a map. And so that's really what the benchmarks from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project do. They look at what would be the natural political preferences of Georgia if you drew, let's say, 1 million maps. And so that's what Princeton has done for us. They drew 1 million maps. And what they've determined is that if you draw 1 million maps and then you just start picking them at random from a bucket, right? These 1 million maps all comply with the laws. They all comply with traditional redistricting criteria. But these 1 million maps have no political intent whatsoever built into them. And the 1 million maps is represented on the top half of this chart. And it says that, you know, a 5 Democrat or a 6 Democrat delegation, you know, which is balanced with an 8 or 9 Republican delegation, either one of those would be reasonably fair. The important thing, however, is that when you look back 10 years ago, that this partisan gap has narrowed. It's narrowed by basically 1 district from where we were 10 years ago. So what we would expect is that maps drawn today, new maps, to meet these fairness criteria, would actually have shown that the partisan gap is narrowed. Now, keep in mind that right now we're sitting at 6 Democrats and 8 Republicans in the delegation. So where do these maps fall? Well, of course, the Republican choice favors them. The Republican choice is for a 5 Democrat, 9 Republican delegation. The Democratic choice is 7-7, right down the middle. So how would we evaluate these two maps? Well, I would say that they both represent a choice which favors their party. I personally happen to like the 8-6 model. And in fact, if you look at Princeton Gerrymandering Project scorecard, where they look at these maps, and they have scored both of these maps on their website, you can go look at it. 8-6 actually turns out to be the single best choice when you look at not only the population metrics, but several other metrics of partisan lean, lopsided wins. There's a number of criteria that they apply. But at the end of the day, the 8-6 choice actually is probably, between the two choices, between the three, is probably a little bit of a better choice. So we have 2 competing maps, and they both kind of represent a partisan choice in our view. This chart kind of summarizes what happened, right? So in this chart, we look at the partisan lean and the competitive districts. On the partisan lean line, again, we're 8-6 today. The Republican proposed map, what it does is it flips the 6th district from 55% Democrat to 54% Republican. That's how it changes from 8-6 to 9-5. The Democrat proposed map, to get to 7-7, what they do is they take that Georgia 10th Democratic district. They make a new Georgia 10th Democratic district. They're merging 3 other districts, the old 10, 9, and 14, into 9 and 14. So they have basically redrawn that area and created a new Democratic district. From a competitive point of view, this is also very important. Today in our map, we have 1 competitive district, and it's the 7th. In the GOP proposed map, we have none. Georgia 7th is now much safer. There are no competitive districts. The Democratic proposed map retains 1 competitive district, so we'll give it a score. We'll give it a good score for that. We wish we had more, but frankly, because of the polarization in Georgia, 1 is probably about all you could expect from these benchmarks. That's what Princeton's benchmark said, anywhere between 0 and 3, but 1 is a pretty obvious choice, as is 0. But you know, we would vote for the 1 over the 0 in this particular case. Now, let's move on and this chart just shows you kind of district by district kind of what the changes are. And this particular chart is showing you for the GOP map. We can't show you a chart like this for the Democratic map because they basically have renumbered and the districts changed a lot. But in this map for the Republican version, what happens is the 6th district flips across from Dem to Republican, and that makes the 7th safer. And that's fundamentally how that map was designed from a partisan point of view. Now let's talk about minority representation, which is another key aspect of how we evaluate these maps, right? So we're going to look at 3 characteristics: the Black majority districts, the minority coalition districts, meaning not just Blacks, but when you consider all minorities together, what kind of districts do you get? And then what we call minority influence districts, or districts where minorities are less than 50%, but still above a threshold of 37%. So what's interesting to me is that both of the proposed maps go backwards on Black majority districts. The current map has 4. The Republican map only has 3. The Democratic map only has 2. And that's because the 2nd and the 5th go slightly under the 50% mark, as you can see on the chart. From a coalition district point of view, we have 1 today. The Republican map would give us 2 because Georgia's 2nd district moves from a Black majority to a coalition majority district. And on the Democratic proposed map, we actually have 4. And so you have Georgia 2nd, 2, and 5 become coalition districts, and it adds the new Georgia 10th and retains the Georgia 7th. So the bottom line is that you have, I think, a pretty strong minority representation in the Democratic map, notwithstanding the question of the 2 districts that were majority Black are now slightly under. And then these influence districts are also interesting because these are districts where in the population you have sufficient minority presence to really influence the vote. The existing map has 4 of them. The GOP proposed map only has 3, and that's because of the changes that are going on in the 6th district. And then in the Democrat proposed map, it retains 4, all 4 of the current ones. I found it interesting that Barack Obama weighed in on the proposed map from the Republicans and said, well, it decreases the voting power of communities of color. I would think that that comment would have potentially applied to the Democratic map based on the Black majority question, which is really an interesting question that needs a little bit of further study. So my summary of, I think, the 2 maps from a minority perspective is that the Democratic map probably is stronger from a minority representation point of view. It still raises this interesting question about the Black majority districts shrinking. The other thing that's interesting is to look at the split cities problem, which we've talked about a lot here. In the 2011, the existing congressional map, we had 2 cities that were split. We had Columbus, which is combined Columbus-Muskogee County, and Athens-Clarke County in the current map. Well, the Republican map actually fixes both of these. It now puts Muskogee County all in 1 congressional district, the 2nd. And in the Athens-Clarke County, both maps actually combine Athens, puts it back into a single congressional district. So those are both positive moves in terms of communities of interest. If those cities and the university in University of Georgia being a community of interest, putting those back into 1 district is a good thing. I'm going to skip this chart in the interest of time, and I'm going to go on to introduce our 2 guest speakers from the ACLU of Georgia. They were briefly introduced by Janet, but let me just introduce briefly for you. David Goldman is Policy Counsel for the ACLU of Georgia. He's a passionate voting rights advocate and attorney. He's committed to protecting and strengthening democratic institutions and civil liberties in Georgia. During the 2020 election cycle, David headed the County Election Administration Monitoring Program and Rapid Response Boiler Room for the Democratic Party of Georgia. Vasu Abhiraman is Senior Policy Counsel and Director of the Voting Access Project for the ACLU of Georgia. Vasu is an attorney and longtime advocate and organizer for voter rights who has co-founded multiple efforts focused on fighting voter suppression. During the 2020 election cycle, Vasu launched the Georgia's poll worker recruitment and deputy registrar programs for the ACLU to train and place thousands of lawyers, IT savvy professionals, and younger election workers in polling places across the state during the COVID-19 pandemic. So great gentlemen from the ACLU with a lot of knowledge. I'm going to turn the program over to them.
Thank you, Ken, for that wonderful introduction. Again, my name is Vasu Abhiraman with the ACLU of Georgia. I'm here with my colleague, David Goldman, and we're here to talk to you about a few things. We're going to talk about what we as the ACLU of Georgia wanted in this process overall. We're going to talk about our personal reactions to the congressional map as 2 voters whose district would change in the GOP's map. We're going to talk about the implication of population trends, national and statewide, on what we might see in the Georgia House and Senate maps, and then legal requirements that the legislature needs to comply with when drawing these maps. So again, we're the ACLU of Georgia. We try to defend the civil liberties of all Georgians. We're an affiliate of the national ACLU. Importantly, we are a nonpartisan group as well. Next slide, please. So let's talk about first our reaction to the congressional maps. Both David and I happen to live in North DeKalb, and I live in Dunwoody. David lives in Chamblee. We would get moved from District 6 to District 4 in this map. What does that mean? Well, at the ACLU, we've called for 3 main things within this process. We've called for transparency, let us know what's happening, make it an open door process, not a closed door process. Let's make sure that the public has meaningful input into this process. We had town halls before the census numbers came out, but we didn't have any since the census numbers came out or after this proposed map came out. We don't think that's meaningful public input. But that's what we've been fighting for. We showed up to all 11 of the town halls that were available to fight for that. And then we want maps, as Ken mentioned, that reflect the diversity of the state. The way we describe it, in accordance with the Voting Rights Act and the Constitution, is maps that allow communities of color to elect candidates of choice just as easily as any other community in Georgia. So when it comes to me, a Dunwoody voter, moving from the 6th district to the 4th district, and the difference between what we asked for and what we saw. And what we asked for is to actually understand what was happening before it happened. This map came out of nowhere without warning. And also what we asked for was transparency on the criteria that was being used to draw these maps. But as I talk to you now, as a voter in the current 6th district that would move to the 4th district, I can't tell you exactly why I would be moving. No criteria has been advanced there. David, do you have any comments?
I do, yeah. Thank you, Vasu, and thank you, Ken, for the introduction earlier. One thing as a voter who lives in Chambly, not far from where Vasu is I think that while voters didn't have much input in this process, I'm thinking that my vote feels like it may mean less. In this new map, we have fewer competitive districts. The 6th Congressional District and the 7th as well were very competitive. They had candidates from both sides who come in and appeal to a large branch of voters, and being moved into a much safer district in the 4th Congressional District. I personally feel like I lose my opportunity to participate in that process, and it just doesn't affect me. It affects many other voters. Funny enough, before I moved to DeKalb, I lived in Gwinnett County. I was over in Duluth, and if I stayed there, I would have also been moved from the 7th Congressional District, as you know, is a very competitive district, to the 9th District, which would be a solidly Republican district. Regardless of my preferences as either a Democrat or a Republican, being put into these districts does take away the ability for me and similar voters to have our voices heard.
So next slide, please. All right, so again, what we're advocating for, I mentioned it before, three main things: transparency in this process, meaningful public input, and then maps that reflect the diversity of our state. Much of the ask about meaningful public input was to be able, for the public to be able to see draft maps for Congress, for State House, and for State Senate before special session occurred in order to deliver input. We had an imperfect version of that delivered for Congress without a meaningful opportunity for the public to comment, aside from a Google forum that has existed since the first town halls at the beginning of the summer. That leaves a lot to be desired, and no maps for the State House and the State Senate. Next slide, please.
We're going to take over here for the next couple of slides. I wanted to talk a little bit with everyone about demographic changes going on in Georgia. First, here in the slide, you can actually see what's going on nationwide. The last 10 years, we've had incredible growth in communities of color. The white population has decreased around 6%, and the community of color population has increased around 6% as well. But if we go look at what's happening in Georgia, the change is even more impressive. And if we could move the next slide there. I think, Ken, this is the point where I would like to share my screen to show this interesting infographic we have. One second. Great. Can everyone see this here? Wonderful. So this graphic here shows the same thing we saw earlier for the change in the white population community of color nationally, but here in Georgia. So you can see that the population of voters who are Black, Hispanic, Asian, mixed race has increased from 44% to 49.9%. Essentially, the white and non-white population in Georgia is equivalent at the moment. So you would see parity here. But when you look at the representation we have in the Georgia legislature, it does not line up with the change in demographic change in the state. So here again, we have around 53% white Georgians and C, and 47% people of color, breaking that down into 31.7% for Black voters, 9% for Hispanic, 5% for Asian. But when we compare that to the legislative makeup, you can see there's a big, that is not proportionally representative. So we have 2/3 of our legislators are white, while we only have 1/3 representing all voters of color. Here's another good graphic here showing the distribution of African-American voters throughout the state. I think one thing we talked about in the slide is how we've had this massive growth, but a lot of it has been focused in Atlanta metro areas or parts of the state. So it's been uneven in growth that makes it a little harder to draw districts that properly represent those voters' preferences. Back to the main slide deck there. Thank you, Ken. And again, you can see these demographic changes here written down into percentages, just to represent, to show that the massive change here in Georgia. 57% increase in Asian voters for the voting age population, 37% for Hispanic, 14% total. So, I mean, Georgia has undergone massive demographic changes in the last 10 years, and those are things that we would like to see represented in new maps that are being drawn.
Next slide, please. So what does this mean, especially when it comes to overall population? It means all of Georgia's growth can be attributed to Georgians of color. And we're talking overall population here, where non-Hispanic white has gone down by 1%, which again means all the population growth that you've seen in Georgia is attributed to communities of color. And as David mentioned before, in pointing out the different concentrations of where voters live in Georgia now and where this growth has occurred, it does present unique challenges to drawing maps that fairly reflect the voting strength of voters of color. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little about the legal requirements for redistricting. Two main forces at play here, the Voting Rights Act and the United States Constitution. The Voting Rights Act is the reason that you hear a lot of talk about majority Black districts in the state. We'll mention this though. The Voting Rights Act and the Constitution work well together in this sense. The goal is not to just increase the number of majority Black districts, right? The goal is to have maps that fairly reflect the voting power of communities of color and to allow communities of color to fairly elect candidates of choice. This means that districts that are already electing the candidates of choice for communities of color could be manipulated by adding more voters of color into those districts in order to claim that what you're trying to do is to increase the number of majority Black or majority minority districts in the state. But that would be an impermissible vote dilution under the Constitution, an impermissible racial gerrymander. And as you look across the state, especially in the Atlanta area, there are many districts in the House and Senate that elect the candidate of choice for communities of color without communities of color or Black voters being a majority of the district. So again, the goal here is not to just increase the number of majority Black or majority minority districts in this state. The goal is to have a map that allows communities of color to elect candidates of choice. And if a district is already electing the candidate of choice for communities of color, to pack that district with more voters of color, or even to just maintain the number of voters of color in that district artificially would be unconstitutional and against the law. So keep that in mind, that the goal here, again, is not to just increase the number of majority minority or majority Black districts.
Thank you for that important point, Vasu. So I know we're up against the clock here, so I just wanted to lastly encourage everyone to click on the link we put in here in the chat. It is the ACLU of Georgia's press release. We sent it out, this letter and packet of information to all members of the Georgia legislature, basically reminding them of their legal obligations to comply with the Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Constitution. If you look, you can go in and look at the information in there, including the letter. It's also changes in each district for Black voting population, Asian voting population, and so on. And if you can go and find your own district and own county and look at that data right there. Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. All right, we'll pass it back to you, Ken.
Great, thank you very much. And at this point, I believe that we're going to actually pass it over to Julie Edelson for introduction of the next section.
Okay. Hey, everyone. So what we're going to talk about next for a little while is what do we expect in this upcoming legislative session. As you most probably know already, we haven't gotten much information from the legislative leadership other than a beginning date and possibly an end date. So one way we can anticipate is to look at how the last redistricting session went. And that's what this slide shows. It's kind of intricate, so I'm going to give you sort of the bottom line. The legislature draws and approves the three sets of maps, the congressional, the state Senate districts, and the state House districts separately. Each of those gets introduced one at a time and goes through the process separately. And that's what this slide is showing. But just to summarize, the legislature met for 11 days over 4 weeks last time. The maps were introduced and considered with overlapping timelines. So, and each of those maps, if you follow these colored dots, you can see each of those maps were completed in just about 7 legislative days. Then the whole process, each map being introduced in one chamber, considered, voted, moved to the other chamber, same process with all 3 maps, and then getting the governor's signature took a total of 23 days, which is very quick, and we expect could be just as quick or quicker this time around. So that's the basic process, but what we want to talk about really is how does it really unfold? What really happens at the Capitol during this legislative session? And to tell us a little bit about that is we're really thrilled to have Representative Margaret Oliver here. Many of you are probably familiar with Representative Oliver. She's a native Georgian and a practicing lawyer. She represents House District 82, which is has a large portion of DeKalb and includes parts of Atlanta and Decatur. She served in the legislature, both House and the Senate, for more than 30 years. She is well respected throughout the General Assembly and is one of the most knowledgeable and most effective legislators. To that point, she's the only Democrat that was appointed by the Speaker to chair a committee, and she chairs the committee that oversees MARTA, which is obviously a very important committee in this part of the state. She has offered and passed numerous pieces of legislation, significant bills, many of which have been focused on the welfare of children and protecting consumers. So with that, let me thank Representative Oliver for being here and turn it over to her.
Thank you, Julie. I'm very pleased to be with you tonight, and I thank you very much for this invitation. We are just a few days away from the beginning of the reapportionment session, and you've reminded me helpfully about how many days we actually took in the last go-round. I thought it was even shorter than 23 days. What the Speaker is setting, the Governor is setting the special session for November 3rd, a week from Wednesday, puts you in a time frame right up to Thanksgiving week. And a lot of us are really speculating, because we are all in the speculation phase, that we really won't go into Thanksgiving week, that we will very likely end the Friday before Thursday Thanksgiving. That's our hope anyway. My district, I'll use my district as an example of how House members and Senate members, because I've been through reapportionment both in the House and the Senate, look at this legislative process. I represent 4 parts of 4 cities and unincorporated DeKalb, from basically the Decatur Courthouse up Claremont Road to 85 on both sides of 85. So I represent parts of Atlanta, Chamblee, Decatur, and Brookhaven. And the growth of the 82nd House District, this is kind of numbers I'm looking at, is very similar, within 1/10 of a percentage point, actually, to the growth of DeKalb County, which is also very, very similar to the growth of Georgia. 10% basically, to be a little bit rounding up and down, is the growth of Georgia, the growth of DeKalb County, and the growth of the House District 82. Reapportionment bills, probably one for the House, a bill, one for the Senate, a bill, and one for congressional districts, will be introduced like any other bill. And the initial publishing of maps, which will come without any kind of drum roll or preliminary hearings, has already happened for the congressional maps, as you know. And I am guessing, I'm giving you an educated guess, that the House district maps and the Senate district maps will be introduced this week before next Wednesday, November 3rd. They'll be introduced on the first day. That's a guess. Even if they aren't introduced this week and they're introduced the first time next Wednesday, November 3rd, they are assigned to a committee. They'll be assigned to the committee in the House Reapportionment Committee and the Senate Reapportionment Committee. And those committees will have some hearings, some format of some hearings. I'm not going to speculate as to how open they'll be or how much testimony but I think they'll have some hearings, and there will be some votes that'll come out of committee, and like any other bill, go to the House rules or the Senate rules, and eventually make their way to the floor of the House for the House bill, the floor of the Senate for the Senate bill, and then like any other bill, have to be passed by both sides, both chambers must vote. And ultimately, like many of the most important bills, they will be resolved in a conference committee. As you know, if the House passes a bill and the Senate passes a bill, same bill, but in different format, it's one of the procedural steps is for the House Speaker to appoint 3 people to a conference committee, and the Senate Lieutenant Governor to appoint 3 people. There'll be 6 people in a conference committee. The conference committee negotiations, I guess, will be in the back room. And my experience in past reapportionment sessions, I've been out of politics periodically, but when I came back into the House after the 2000 census, I was vice chair of the reapportionment committee. And the negotiations the Democrats were in charge, sort of. Then the House had Democrats, the Senate had Republicans, and Sonny Perdue were at the end of the Roy Barnes administration. So we had a mixture of folks, but I remember it being backroom. And at that time, I remember also that most, and I think this could be true again, most of the people, I'm talking about the House members and the Senate members for our districts, most of us are relatively satisfied. A small percentage, I don't know whether it's 10%, 5%, 15%, are very agitated and are very much a part of the negotiations. Every reapportionment session, to me, has a political agenda for everybody in a variety of ways. It has a litigation agenda. When I was a young lawyer, so did David, Vasu's age, I did voting rights cases myself. And the kind of cases I did were easy cases. I would bring a case against Henry County or Spalding County that had not pre-cleared or had failed to pre-clear, gotten opposition to a pre-clearance of a single member moving to an at-large district so that minority districts would be eliminated. Those were early cases of voting rights. Henry County, for instance, hadn't even submitted its case. It's redistricting to countywide voting and claimed they really stood up in federal court and claimed that the Voting Rights Act didn't apply to them. Those are cases where you're going to have easy decisions and results that drew favorable minority districts proportionate to the African-American population. The growth in the 82nd district, to move forward to modern times, the 10% growth has been, as gentlemen have previously said, disproportionately minority voters. 82nd House District now is a 50.5 majority minority district. The Hispanic population has moved to 80%, 18%. African American percentage has moved 21%, and the Asian percentage has moved to 9% in the middle of DeKalb. And what that reflects is exactly what David and Vasu have talked about, is that the growth of the 82nd district, the growth of DeKalb County, the growth of Georgia is disproportionately voters of color. Question I've got that David and Vasu can, you are talking about population numbers, you are not talking about registered voters. And one of the things I've been trying to get my hands on for my district, and again, I use this as an example because other people are probably similarly doing these kind of drill downs. Will I know at what point what the registered voters are? The minority registered voters are of the House District 82. And y'all can answer that question later, which is a different number, a different percentage than voting age population percentages. And we can talk about why that matters and who it matters to. And then there's the political rules, and then there's a litigation strategy. And the congressional map set forth by the Republicans and the House map set forth by the Democrats, I think, have a litigation strategy. How much are the maps in compliance with what we anticipate the rules and the methods are of the committee, and how much are they in compliance with the emerging case law? And there will be new, as there is every cycle, new emerging case law for this round of reapportionment. What will we know and when will we know it? Is a question that people like me are really interested in. I think it's possible that this week we'll have a press event by the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats where they announce support for House districts and Senate district races, and a map will be revealed. The Democratic caucus of the House and the Democratic caucus of the Senate, and we'll be meeting in caucuses as we do during the regular session. We'll be taking votes in support of our maps. Our maps are a proposal with a litigation strategy and a political strategy, and the Republicans, I'm guessing, will have a litigation strategy and a political strategy, and the Republicans have the majority of votes in both the House and the Senate. And if you can assume, which I think is a fair assumption, that the votes are a party line, then the Republican map will prevail for all three bills that are introduced. If it prevails, if I'm right about that guess, that there's purely a partisan vote, then the litigation strategy becomes more important and more significant. How much risk, this is how I think, and this is how House members and senators are thinking, who are looking at both strategies, how much risk will the Republicans take that their map will be thrown out? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm really curious about that. How risky, how confident do they feel about pushing through a partisan supporting Republican map that is 9-5 Republicans? I think that's a big stretch. I think they'd be super lucky to get an 8-6 map in the congressional levels. The House and the Senate, on our level, my level, we have various goals or hopes that we will increase the number of Democratic seats in both sides, but also increase the number of competitive seats. How many competitive seats will come out of the Georgia General Assembly's special session of 2021? The General Assembly special sessions are always unique because they're usually only a handful of bills, 2 or 3, as I've discussed, which might get combined into one at the end, as bills do. I, as a MARTOC chair and other chairs, will be having committee hearings on other issues. There'll be some other business going on, but very likely to have any votes in any other committee, other than perhaps some study committee, which I'm involved in on the annexation and cityhood matters. There's a lot of downtime. And history has shown us that there's a lot of playing golf. And we're going to have the World Series going on during a small part of the special session. It passes quickly. It gets stuck based on unpredictable political challenges that come based on personality or come based on political strategy versus legal strategy. I'm not really looking forward to it, but I am looking forward to it being over and us getting back to other business and real business that directly relate to what people are thinking about today. I'm happy to answer any questions. I might not have covered what you'd asked me to cover, and I'm happy to talk more about things that interest you.
Thank you, Representative Oliver. That was great. Learning from your experience. We're going to go to a Q&A session now, and with all of our panelists. So I forgot to mention at the start, if you have a question based on what you just heard, and I have a lot of questions, please put that in the chat and we will bring those questions forward for our panel. And I think we'll start with Representative Oliver's question for our ACLU colleagues. Vasu or David, do you want to try and take that?
So a couple of things to say about the registered voter population. One, Georgia has made great strides since 2016 when it comes to registered voters as a percentage of overall voting age population because of automatic voter registration being adopted that year. So in many parts of the state, those totals are relatively similar because of automatic voter registration. VAP is the voting age population is the general number that's used for a lot of these calculations. And I think in Georgia, it's fair to use the voting age population as a general number. That being said, being able to figure out where registered voters are in the state, that is definitely possible. It's just not a number that we and our national analytics team work with for various reasons. But I think in terms of any legislators that want that information, we should be able to get that.
It's not legally relevant, but it's politically relevant in some very close districts. Is that a short summary?
I think so. I think that's fair.
Representative Oliver, one of the things that certainly we are going to be looking at as well in our analysis of the maps as they come out is the pairing of incumbents. And I know there's been a lot of that's happened on both sides of the aisle in the past. Can you kind of speak to that and the special issues related to that this year with the timing of special session?
I'm very confused about how the litigation strategy is going to overlay with the dates to qualify and how that will, the timing of all that's just, I mean, it's confusing. The pairing of incumbents together is a true, tried and true mechanism to get rid of incumbents. I came back into politics after being out for a while in the Roy Barnes design of multi-member districts. And my district was designed for a Democrat to win and replace a Republican. That's what happened. The courts have not really drawn out, if not really said that multi-member districts violate constitutional law. I've not seen a case. You can tell me if I'm wrong about that, but they don't like them. And they think it's gamesmanship. And so, and the pairing of unpopular with the leadership, I mean, unpopular, I'll say Republicans for this analysis, unpopular Republicans who have not been team players in the Republican Party who really count on good, compliant, quiet, do as I say voters in the Republican majority. They were designed to lose in contests that were set up. There was a lot of painful loss of women, very talented, high-skilled women after the 2010 session. Loss of designed to lose Stephanie Stuckey, Ellie Dobbs, designed to lose Kathy Ash, Pat Gardner, designed to lose a couple others. And so that was kind of a painful reality for me. White women lawyers tended to lose their seats in pairings, kind of a painful hit around that. But that's just an example of everybody feels some pain through this very, very difficult, painful process.
Mm-hmm. I see we've got some questions in the chat. So from Karen McGowan, who I know you know, Representative Oliver, she had a question about the about your statement about the 9-5 congressional map being being a stretch. Do you want to comment a little bit more on your thoughts?
Well, I think that Vasu is right. Ken is right. We don't grow in exactly the best way to design the equality, design equal congressional districts. But if you go from 8-6 to 9-5, I'm just thinking with you. I'm not telling you what will happen. Then you really are moving away from exactly what the population is doing. Population has moved to 50-50. It's obvious to everybody. You don't have to go to a calculator. You don't have to go to Maptitude. I mean, we are a 50-50 state. And if you move away from that, then you are avoiding the reality of what the voters are in Georgia. That would be my argument. It'd be a simple argument. You went exactly the direction away from what the voters say they want.
Ken, do you want to respond to that in terms of kind of the Princeton analysis and their grading of a 8-6 being, I think, what they would consider to be an A map? Is that right?
That's right. That's right. And I think Representative Oliver said it correctly. I mean, the issue is that we are still clustered as voters in Georgia. We have deep, very many deep pockets of Democrats. We have large territories of Republicans. That's just the way Georgians live. Now, and then that makes it very difficult to find, maps of a particular style. But what the million maps told us was that 8-6 was a very, very valid choice, as is the 9-5. But the deal is, as I think, as Representative Oliver is saying, is that you have an 8-6 delegation today. That delegation has been arrived at over a couple of competitive election cycles in which 2 districts ultimately flipped in a map that was designed 10 years ago, right? And so you've arrived at 8-6 in terms of your delegation, and to try to draw a map that ultimately, I mean, that map is designed to flip the 6th back to Republicans. And so that clearly is not the will of the voters, right? When Princeton scored these maps, they said, 8-6 or 9-5 is a valid statistical choice, but there's other metrics that they use to say, look at lopsided wins, look at other characteristics that we didn't talk about today. It's another layer of detail beyond the benchmarks we showed you. And all those say that 9-5 is not a good representation of a 50-50 state. That's really the issue, right? 8-6 is pretty good because just the way we're clustered, Democrats are clustered, there's going to be, and Republicans are spread out. So at the end of the day, they rated 8-6 as probably the single best choice because it was going to result in, the right split, and then you wouldn't have leaning one way or the other in terms of some of the other metrics. So, I mean, it just is, it's a reality of being a polarized state, but, 8-6 would be, I mean, to me, that and telling to me that it falls between the 2 choices that I'm seeing, one from Democrats, one from Republicans, I say, well, seems to me that's a good compromise, another way to put it. Now, my question back to Representative Oliver is, and I think that's the gist of the question from the audience, Karen, is, well, okay, but 9-5 is a stretch, but how do you, there's no legal way to stop it if it's only a partisan issue. There's got to be some other, I'm not sure if it's subject, it can be negotiated that way, or if it becomes down to some litigation matter around minority representation, right? So I just ask Representative Oliver to comment on that additional question.
I think I have to painfully agree with you that since the United States Supreme Court has avoided the issue of partisan gerrymandering as being violative of constitutional rights thus far. But the overlay, the divisiveness and the polarization, the overlay is that if 78% of the people in my 82nd House district voted for Joe Biden, 28% voted for Trump, and I have a 50.05 minority population, I don't have to prove that the Hispanic and Asian and African American population individually voted in a democratic fashion. It says it speaks for itself. that only 28% voted Republican. So if you using my district as an example, if you tried to make my district a Republican district, which would be kind of hard to do, the geography of DeKalb, then you're taking power away from minorities. There are other districts around outside of DeKalb where that legal challenge is going to be based on the reality that voters of color are being denied their voting rights and power. If you move away what the general voters of Georgia want.
So one of the other questions related to minority populations is obviously we've seen a big increase in the Hispanic population in Georgia. And one of the questions from Diane Doherty is that that increase is spread across Georgia. So how do Hispanic population gain access to representation when they really have that spread? I don't know, David or Vasu, do you want to respond to that?
I mean, that's a good question, right? As you try to draw single member districts that are, contiguous, you can't draw a district that includes all the Hispanic voters in Georgia. And if they're spread out, we'll just have to deal with that. That being said, where Hispanics vote for candidates of choice in coalition with other groups of voters of color, including Black voters, certainly that is something that should be taken into account in drawing these maps in order to ensure that Hispanic voters in those areas can elect candidates of choice. And then hopefully in one of those districts, Hispanic candidates can be elected, as they have been elected in districts that are not majority Hispanic. So I think it comes down to the way Hispanic voters vote and the other groups that vote in similar patterns, and the way the maps are drawn to, either dilute those votes or to empower those votes.
And I think I'm saying this right, Ken, correct me if I'm wrong. When we looked at the benchmarks for the House here in Georgia, we do believe that there is an opportunity for a majority Hispanic district. And so we'll be interested when we see the House maps to see if that in fact is proposed.
Right, that's in the Dalton area, right?
And was it Dalton or Gwinnett?
Well, there are a few pockets where it might be possible. At a state house district, it's 59,500 people. It's small enough. There's probably a couple candidates for that. Dalton's a good candidate. Some areas of Gwinnett, potentially Roswell. There are some pockets, and you can, on our maps, you can kind of see those. So it's quite possible to draw one. Now, will they draw one? That's another good question. But we think that statistically, it is now becoming possible for one to surface through this process.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for one other question. And Mary Lou, I've seen some scroll by here. Do you have one that you think we should go to as our last question?
There are several good questions. Here's a quick one. This was a question by Steve Tigers, and he wants to know if Lucy McBath's district was particularly targeted by the Republicans.
I'll give a nonpartisan answer to that. As somebody who would move from the 6th district to the 4th district, the 6th district, in terms of the population it had to be drawn to, was nearly exactly what it needed to be. The lines barely had to change, but the lines changed dramatically, moving voters like me and David to another district. But the reason for that wasn't given. So given the fact that they didn't have to change those lines very drastically in accordance with the total population they needed to meet, I think the explanation's in that.
Ken had a great slide for that, but yeah, the 7th congressional district needed a lot of population transfers given the large growth in population there. But of course, as Vasu mentioned, the 6th did not.
Okay. Well, I wish we had more time to have this conversation with this fabulous panel. We thank you so much. And we are going to move on to really tell all of the folks that joined us tonight about all the opportunities there are for you to get involved. This is the time, as we said, it's showtime. So this slide is we're carrying over from our last town hall meeting. And we just want to remind you, this is even more timely again now, or just as timely as it was last month. And that is we have the opportunity at a national level, at a federal level, to really deal with redistricting reform. And that is in the Freedom to Vote Act, which was put forward by our own senator, Senator Warnock. And there are some significant reforms within the Freedom to Vote Act for redistricting. So it definitely has voting rights issues addressed as well. But this is an opportunity to reach out to your representative, even though we have 2 senators that are supporting this, and many of our representatives supporting this, even though they are supporting it, it's still important to reach out and let them know of your support so that they can continue to advocate for passage of the Freedom to Vote Act. Next slide. Then we are really excited to be participating in special session here at Fair Districts. And we are going to be at the Capitol. This is going to be an in-person event at the Capitol on November 3rd. We thought it was really important for the legislature to see us there, to know that we are concerned, that we're continuing to advocate for transparency, for fair maps. And so we will have a team at the Capitol, and we'd love to have you join us. It's going to be from 11 to 3. And we have a number of activities planned. We have a number of legislators that are going to come and speak with us. And we have some outreach activities that we're going to be doing that are really important to, again, continue to put our information in front of legislators. So please join us. You can see the bit.ly there to sign up to join us. Our registrations are going to be limited because we are trying to be safe with COVID, and so we have a limited amount of opportunity to sign up. So sign up today so that you can get your spot and join us at the Capitol on special session opening day. Next slide. So this is an opportunity through a coalition that Fair Districts and the ACLU are a part of. And these are redistricting advocate organizations that really were concerned that the legislature has not given an opportunity for more formal public comments now that maps are being proposed. And so we are putting together our own public hearing. This is going to be a public hearing where folks who are impacted by these proposed changes, certainly Vasu and David could sign up and speak about their move from the 6th to the 4th district and question that. We're encouraging that these comments also be put formally into the portal that the legislature has for formal comment, but we want people to have an opportunity to weigh in, and then we as advocates will continue to amplify that information with the legislature. So please sign up for that. It's Thursday at 6 o'clock. Each person that signs up will have the opportunity to testify for probably about 3 minutes is what we're going to do. So it's not a huge piece to put together. You can come and share your opinion, and we will again bring that forward. Next slide. And our action team has been up and going now for over a month. Every week, and this will probably be a little bit more frequent as we go into special session, but every week our action team has been getting really powerful messages to relay to legislative leadership and folks on the committees. So if you aren't already part of our action team, please sign up. This is a way we'll be communicating actions that we need to take in a rapid response kind of fashion during special session. And here at the bottom, again, I want to remind, we continue to remind every month that you still can submit written testimony to the redistricting committees. There is this portal where you can put your comments in, and that becomes part of the formal record of this redistricting cycle and could potentially be used in litigation, as Representative Oliver spoke to. So it's really important, if you haven't already done that, it doesn't take long. It's 1,000 character limit, so it's like 3 tweets or 4 tweets. Please make your opinion known. And then next slide, the last slide, and that is that we have set our date for our next town hall meeting. We are not going to be meeting in November, given that we're going to be in special session through November, and we did want to take Thanksgiving off. But on December the 6th, we are going to do a wrap up and really try to walk through what happened during special session, what the results are, where we think the priorities are going to be in terms of policy issues for next year and for the regular general session next year. And I know I saw some of the questions in the chat about things like independent redistricting commissions. We'll be back in that topic definitely for next year. So please join us on December the 6th. We'll be coming out with a registration link soon for that, but go ahead and mark it on your calendars. And so with that, I think we are going to say good night to everybody. And again, thank you to our guests tonight. Thank you to the ACLU for all of your support and your sponsorship for this program, to Representative Oliver for joining us. And thank you to the team that makes these happen. There's a lot of people behind the scenes. So thank you to Leslie, to Cindy, I'm going to miss names, so I'm not going to name them all, but thank you to that. And thank you for joining us tonight. And please be engaged as we go into this critical period with special session next week. Thank you.